Hi, and welcome to Check Your Thread, a podcast about sewing more sustainably. My name's Zoe, and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 13 years and am the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge, Me Made May. But like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and the way my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me on this journey. Hello, Check Your Thread heads. How are you doing today? Very, very well, I hope. I'm okay, pretty tired though. It's just been a busy couple of weeks and I feel like I haven't had the chance to catch up with myself, you know. But it's the half-term break next week, so I'm hoping that not having to have crazy busy mornings will help me recalibrate a bit. Before I get stuck into what I've been up to, I want to mention a really interesting challenge hosted by Sophie, who is at so via Instagram. It's a super accessible challenge to sew something in advance of International Women's Day on the 8th of March. So apparently the theme of International Women's Day this year is break the bias, and Sophie couldn't resist a sewing pun. So she's encouraging makers to sew something, literally anything, big or small, and share it using the hashtags #IWDSewChallenge and #BreakTheBias. Or you can even reshare something you've already made that fits the theme. Sophie is keen to stress that it can be as involved or as low energy as you wish. I was thinking that it could be a great opportunity to explore some ideas around feminism or challenging female stereotypes perhaps. Anyway, it's very cool and very exciting, and I'll put the links to Sophie and her explanation in the show notes. So how have your creative projects been going lately? This week I've been enjoying wearing both my denim patchwork dungarees and my hand-knitted cardigan a lot. Sewing-wise, over the last week, I've made a zero-waste cropped shirt using the pattern by Birgitta Helmerson. I've made that for my friend Harriet out of some fawn-coloured linen that's been in my stash for about 3 years. Harriet and I are actually working on a very loosely collaborative project together at the moment for the duration of the year. We're taking in turns to pick a word each month that may or may not inform our individual creative endeavours. It's been really interesting to see how those words and themes make themselves known, even when you're not directly focusing on them. So last month's word was renewal and this month's is explore. So I chose to make Harriet a garment as a kind of celebration of our year-long project. Okay, sustainability wins. This one is part of a long-term sustainability goal of mine that I mention fairly regularly, and that is seeing how much food I can grow in our little garden. Last weekend, I attended a seed swap called Seedy Sunday. The idea is that you bring along seeds that you've collected from plants you've grown or from commercial seed packets that you don't want, and you swap them for others. I've never managed to attend before, and I had the best time. So it was held in a market space in Brighton, and there were lots of tables with different types of seeds on. So I took a load that either I had too many of or that I knew that I would never grow because they're not veggies that we eat in our house. And I picked up about 10 packets of seeds that I am excited to try growing. My main goal for going there was to try and get some different types of tomatoes because they did really well in our garden last year. Plus they're so versatile and everyone in my family will eat them in some form or other. And I managed to bag myself 5 different varieties on top of the 2 that I still have at home. Honestly, I cannot wait to get planting in a couple of months. Also, on the way home from work yesterday, someone was giving away a wire shoe rack outside their house. So I picked it up and I'm thinking that if I cover it in clear plastic, I might be able to fashion myself a kind of mini greenhouse propagator of sorts. So in my house, I don't have any south-facing windows. They're either kind of east or west or north. So bringing on seedlings was actually a bit of a challenge last year. So I'm thinking if I can put my seedlings out in this thing in the garden during the day, then I can bring it in at night and they might do a bit better. Well, obviously I will report back. There's been some lovely feedback on last week's episode, which looked into the Make Amend campaign. Lots of you found it really interesting, and some of you shared some memories of how the shortages affected older members of your family, so thank you so much for that. Lovely listener Tessa Green also sent me some photos she'd taken, which were of a reproduction leaflet of the same era, but produced in the US. There wasn't an official clothing rationing scheme in the US as there was in the UK, but there were restrictions and shortages. The leaflet was imparting the importance of make and mend, as they call it, and it was really fascinating to get a sense of the slightly different and much more patriotic tone of the US version from the image that she shared. Thanks again, Tessa! There's yet more thank yous due because this week the podcast got another 2 wonderful new patrons. Massive thanks to Paula and Vic. You are superstars for helping make it possible for me to produce more episodes. Apologies, Mi Paola, if I've pronounced your name wrong. I always research how to pronounce names that I'm not certain of, but I drew a blank this week and I just couldn't find out, so I apologise. More details on how to support Check Your Thread via Patreon in the show notes and on the website. So let's get stuck into the second instalment of my mini-series about the Make, Do, Amend campaign. So informed by the research that I did for last week's more historical episode, I've been exploring the connections as I see them between the Make, Do, Amend era and life today as we try to tackle climate change. I've had a bunch of thoughts on why there's currently insufficient action happening to address the climate crisis. This episode also concerns itself with the idea that there are lessons we can learn from the experiences of the Second World War that might be applicable today. Things that can help us live and create in a way that limits our impact on climate change. You'll find a breakdown of the points discussed plus additional links in the show notes on the website checkyourthread.com. Okay, enjoy! Last week's episode opened up the subject of the Make, Do, Amend campaign that was championed by the British government during the Second World War. I delved into the historical and social context of it. I talked about the shortages of materials and products and the clothes rationing scheme that was invented to try to mitigate its effects and ensure equal access to suitable clothing for all. As I was reading and writing about that era, I couldn't help think about the situation we find ourselves in today with the climate crisis. So much of what I was reading about relating to the use and reuse of materials felt so familiar to the stuff that I've been thinking and talking about, and I know that others are thinking and talking about at the moment as well. Many of us are trying to work out how to consume less and be more resourceful whilst continuing to make stuff and be creative. So this second instalment of my mini-series is a bit of a personal thought experiment. I'm working through some of the ideas and themes that revealed themselves to me when I was looking into the Make, Do, Amend era and thinking about them in the context of today. My hypothesis is that there are some lessons that we can learn from the experiences of the Second World War that might be applicable to help us live and create in a way that limits our impact on climate change. To some, I guess it might sound overly dramatic to liken living through a world war to living on a planet as we experience the effects of climate change. I agree, it does sound dramatic. But is it overly dramatic? I don't know, maybe it's not. Maybe there are ways in which it's comparable. Of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but perhaps governments should be treating the climate crisis with the same level of importance as a world war. I think there are a number of reasons why that feels so unlikely right now. An expert in socio-political studies would of course be far better placed to comment on this, but my lack of expertise doesn't mean to say that I'm not allowed to offer my opinion. So here are my initial thoughts on why our governments are not able to perceive that parallel and act accordingly at the moment. Firstly, the climate change is an international emergency, and tackling it needs to be a global effort. But the nationalistic mentality of most current governments prevents the unified actions required, as we saw at the recent COP26 event. And so many governments and political parties are backed by big businesses who have no interest in making the major shifts required to truly tackle climate change, in particular a move away from rampant consumerism. Secondly, as I mentioned a couple of times in last week's episode, the level of government intervention into everyday life during the Second World War was far greater than it had been before. And even after the experiences of how life changed during the pandemic, I'm pretty sure that most people would find that 1940s level of government intervention completely unacceptable today. Can you imagine the outcry if the UK government, for example, tried to implement rationing next week? The government would most likely be voted out at the first opportunity, if not ousted by a vote of no confidence before even making it to a general election. Even though the climate change poses a very real threat to all life on planet and has already claimed many lives, it's not being portrayed and therefore understood as a real and tangible threat to rally together and fight against like the Nazis in the Second World War. Which leads me to my third reason. During the Second World War, for all participants, there was a clear enemy and a pretty clear apportion of blame for the war itself. It was far easier to band together in collective efforts and to stomach rationing and government directives and so forth. Deciding who is to blame for the climate crisis is so much more complicated. Do we blame the industrialists at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution? Jeff Bezos? Shell? You and me? The causes of the climate crisis and the multitude of other problems we're currently facing are so complex and multifaceted, and we are all responsible to a greater or lesser degree for our own carbon footprint. And if we don't know who's to blame or what arenas we should go and fight in, where do we direct our anger and our action? It's no surprise that so many people are effectively choosing to stick their fingers in their ears and carry on as though nothing's happening. I guess the final issue that I sense is about what we're actually fighting for. The Second World War brought about so much destruction, so many lives were lost and entire cities were razed to the ground. But there was still the promise that if the war was won, life would go back to some kind of normalcy for most. We don't have that same level of promise when it comes to climate change. The future can't look like today, and we can't continue to live like we've been used to all our lives. It's so difficult to envision what we're meant to be fighting for, and that's scary and difficult to rally behind. But we all know on some level that inaction is not an option. And whilst we want to see governments and businesses take dramatic action, we can't sit around waiting. So whilst we vote with our literal votes and with our money, we sign petitions, join marches and everything else, we've also got to make changes within our own lives wherever we see an opportunity, and to start conversations and spread ideas. That's what I've been trying to do with this podcast, for example. And I'm the first to admit that changing which thread you buy, or whether or not you chuck out your fabric scraps, is just a drop in the ocean. However, those changes spill out into other areas of our lives, and it adds up to something much larger. So what lessons can we learn from the Make to Amend era that we can apply to our own actions and mindsets right now? I'm going to start with my favourite of all the themes that struck me from my research, and that is community. Even the British government during the era of stiff upper lip acknowledged the importance of community. Many of the newsreels and pieces of literature created and distributed by the government encouraged people to get together. Whether that was to join Make to Amend groups set up by councils and existing bodies, or to start your own. Coping with the rationing scheme and keeping yourselves and your families sufficiently clothed in the face of shortages would have felt pretty overwhelming on top of everything else that was going on. So getting together to share ideas and learn new approaches and techniques for garment mending and creation made complete sense. I also imagine that those Make to Amend groups, be that the official ones set up and run by your local council, or an informal get-together with a couple of friends around someone's kitchen table, would have been a real source of joy and togetherness. We are so lucky with the internet that we have even more options available to us to connect with others. Through social media, we can get inspired, motivated, supported and taught by someone who is on the literal other side of the world, as well as whoever lives around the corner to us. So how can we make more of online connections? Firstly, by following the accounts, blogs and websites of those who truly inspire us. People who have interesting, supportive or even challenging things to say, not just following the accounts that you're quote-unquote meant to follow, or those who produce pretty stuff but honestly they don't really align with our values or make us think in some way. Don't be afraid to leave comments or send a quick DM or email to someone you admire or feel a connection with. Everybody who creates and shares their work wants to know that they're not just posting into the void, so they'd love to know that what they wrote or made resonated with you. It's possible that you'll start some wonderful friendships that way. I'm thinking of several online friends that I have who I genuinely care about and think about just as much as some of my in real life people. I also think it's important not just to follow and read the work of those who exactly mirror our own beliefs, worldviews or styles. Remember to be open to those who don't completely reflect who you are and who challenge you in some way. Following those people can be a real source of growth and understanding. And of course, we need to foster, COVID permitting, in real life community. For those of us into sewing, getting to meet up and chat with other sewers or even work on projects together can bring such a wonderful dimension to our usually solitary activities. If you live in a city or decent-sized town, or even in some villages, there's every chance that there's an existing sewing group that you could attend. And if not, consider starting up your own. It doesn't have to be a big time sap, it could start with just one other person in a WhatsApp group. If it's garment sewing that's your regular jam, but you can't find a local group and don't fancy starting anything, consider some garment sewing adjacent groups and activities to join. Is there a local quilting group or a knitting and crochet group that would be happy for you to rock up and do some hand stitching whilst you chat? Or find out if there's a street stitching, stitch it, don't ditch it meetup near you, so you can get together and tackle your mending pile in public whilst also doing some gentle protest at the same time. So linked to community, my second takeaway from the Make to Amend era is swapping. Our collective stuff now outweighs all living things on Earth, and consumption is now a bigger driver of environmental breakdown than population, which means that how much we buy is more damaging to the planet than how many of us there are. Thanks to Jen Gale from Sustainableish for those facts. Every time we buy a brand new anything, we are putting additional pressure on the planet by requiring the extraction of more resources and creating more damage by processing them into goods and transporting them around the globe. There are so many materials and items already in existence, we just don't need to go out and buy brand new everything for every project. If we don't have something suitable already in our possession, all of us who make stuff can find more of the things we want to craft with from alternative sources. Equally, if we've been holding on to stuff for yonks that we most likely won't use, we can offer it out into the world. It's far more likely to fall into the hands of someone who will actually use it, and in turn help them not buy something brand new, if it no longer lives in your drawer. Swapping can help us do that. During the Second World War, the Women's Voluntary Service regularly organised clothing swaps for both children's and adults' clothing. And I imagine that heaps of less organised swapping of materials and resources occurred during those Make Do Amend events. In more recent decades, clothing swaps and swishes have sprung up to help people pass on the items languishing in their wardrobe and get a new look for next to nothing. Almost all of us who make stuff are sitting on a ton of resources. Zips, buttons, threads, fabric, equipment of all types that we're probably never going to use. Let's use our resourcefulness to make swapping and passing on those things a more frequent occurrence. And let's be open to the definition of swapping. It could be a direct thing-for-thing swap that takes place between two friends, for example. Or it could be a broader, I'm giving this away with the acknowledgement that the universe will most likely send something else my way at some point. It could be organising an in-person fabric swap through a local sewing meetup perhaps, or with some of your sewing pals. It could be offering up or requesting items via Freegal or FreeCycle, or your local Facebook swap groups. It could be sharing or passing on supplies via the internet, whilst also possibly raising money for charity, for example the @DStash for Kids with Cancer account on Instagram. It could be donating, attending or selling at second-hand supply sales like Fabric-a-Brac that happens in various locations in New Zealand. There are so many ways to acquire or pass on existing things if you do a little digging. Another of my favourite themes that jumped out to me from my reading is the idea of alternative sources of fabric. Today we are so lucky to have an abundance of fabric options to sew with if we have the funds and access to shops and the internet. However, as we've discussed, our current pace of consuming everything is not sustainable for the planet, and that includes fabric, my friends. Many of us are considering how we can use alternative sources of fabric as a way to keep what already exists in use for longer, and to reduce the demand for virgin resources. When dressmaking fabric became difficult to get hold of and more expensive during the Second World War, many inventive sewers looked to different sources of fabric to make with. There was a lot of reusing existing garments happening. There are, of course, heaps of people who frequently reuse existing garments in their making today. If you haven't already, make sure you listen to episode 26 with Eliu Hernandez, where he talks about how he reclaims and reuses all sorts of materials from existing jeans, for example. But when existing garments weren't providing the right type or quantity of fabric needed, people turned to more left-field sources of fabric. It has been documented that during the Second World War, clothing was made out of blackout curtaining, furnishing fabric, blankets, butter muslin, parachute silk and silk escape maps. Today, we all have access to existing alternative textiles with heaps of garment making potential. Unwanted curtains, blankets, beddings, towels, sofa throws and who knows what else are available from most charity shops and thrift stores and op shops, very often for less money per metre than regular dressmaking fabric would be. Plus, there are heaps of creative people getting busy with even more out there discarded or alternative materials and making clothing and accessories from them. Accessories brand Wyatt & Jack make incredible things from broken beach inflatables, bouncy castles and old deck chair canvases. Freitag uses old tarpaulins from haulage vehicles and bicycle inner tubes to make their incredible bags. There are small brands making items from the skins of broken umbrellas and others using the covers from discarded tents and unwanted sleeping bags found at festivals. Former podcast guest Ricardo Guido made a couple of wonderful jackets using the leather from an old discarded sofa. I've got the cover from an old clothes dryer that I plan to make into a bag to take to the swimming pool. If you can sew it, there's quite possibly a way you can use it to make clothing or accessories, so try and keep an open mind about the unused items you find in your home or elsewhere. It can save you money as well as scratching a creative itch that most projects that use a length of new fabric can't reach. I'm going to wrap this up now and go into the next 3 themes during next week's episode. Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!